Welcome to Long Waves, a new show brought to you by Gary Krug through KYRS, your radio station. So, this is the premiere episode of Long Waves, and I thank you for joining us today. I don't know why you're listening. Maybe it was an accident that you tuned in. Maybe you heard the promos. Maybe you saw the Facebook posts. I don't know. But I'm glad you're here, and I thank you for joining me. This is the day after Veterans Day, and I'm going to be talking about Veterans Day, particularly some of the long waves of Veterans Day. But first, I need to give, I think, a bit of a prologue about why this show exists, why I wanted to do this show, and why I wanted to do it at KYRS. Above all, Long Waves is a show about the human voice and about telling stories. The stories I'm going to be telling are largely stories about other stories in the media, but they're stories that I'll be telling not in terms of what's happening now, but in terms of what happened before, what did it mean, what are the parallels, what are the similarities, what's not being told. So some of the stories I tell you may know, some of them I hope are new to you, and so news to you, but primarily the show is about listening. It's about you listening to one voice. And listening is a particular kind of special experience that human beings have when we listen to the voice of other people. We tend to quickly forget television. We tend to quickly forget the newspapers. Nothing's older than yesterday's news. But we tend to remember voices. We tend to remember conversations. When we look at most of what we call mass media, it's great for reaching the masses. It really is. It's very good for transmitting ideas to a lot of people across a lot of space. But generally the mass media are very poor for building community, for building ideas across time. But we remember the voice. Voice has an immediate sense of presence. It's another person, in this case, speaking real words, human words, not industrial words, not propaganda, not mainstream news, nothing resembling news. Rather a completely different kind of voice. In this voice, I hope you find meaning woven into culture, woven into history, and woven into stories about who we are and what's going on in the world. This show will not be form. It will not be the quickly digested little bits that are grasped instantly and lost almost as quickly. So in the course of this show, over the next several months, there's a range of stories that I'm looking forward to talking about. We'll have to talk about media, certainly. Contemporary media as an economic and industrial product. This is key to understanding why the media tell the kinds of stories they do. We'll have to look at the ways in which media manipulates language to build consensus, to put ideas into people's minds. And we'll have to look at how media then becomes a mode of social control, and how this works in very real ways in the everyday world. Some of the shows I want to bring to you in the near future will deal with culture. And if you go to a university and you study culture, you'll find that they talk about race, class, and gender. Now, these are important categories, but they're also very problematic. Race is largely invented. People make it up. Hispanic was made up by the U.S. Census Department. Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda was made up by the Belgians. Race is largely invented, and so it's largely meaningless, or it serves people who have power. Class is an abstraction and extremely changeable. If we think of what's happening to the middle class around the world, but particularly in the United States, it's evaporating. So what's happening to all those people who used to be middle class, and what exactly does class mean anymore? And then the third category that's commonly used when talking about culture is gender. But gender is probably the most problematic of all the three categories in the current world. If we think of gender in terms of all of the complex renegotiations that are going on in law, in the streets, in bars, in people's heads, in magazines, in discussions, in people's lives, gender is one of the things that is being negotiated and redefined most extremely. So talking about race, class, and gender is pretty problematic. So rather, I want to use history, I want to use philosophy, I want to look at some of what the great minds on the subjects have said, and to look at a range of voices. And this is a key bit, because when we talk about race, when we talk about class, when we talk about gender, we tend to exclude some voices. And there are a multitude of voices that we can't even begin to consider including, we simply haven't heard yet. So do these categories give power to voices, or do they block them? I'll leave that to you. Some of the shows will examine violence, and violence will be a theme woven through a lot of shows, especially the use of power and this peculiar idea that we seem to excel at in this culture, that fortune is a privilege, that fortune, something that happened to you through no doing of your own, through no special achievement, no special talent, no special skill, somehow grants you privilege. And from this we have this peculiar notion of American exceptionalism, which is another issue we're going to have to talk about at some length as the shows develop. It's important to realize when we talk about violence and we talk about power and we talk about the sense of entitlement, that how we treat the least fortunate among us says more about us and our understanding of power and violence than almost anything else. How people treat the less fortunate speaks volumes about these people. So, in terms of violence, for instance, we're going to have to, in a very soon show, examine what it means that a president, Barack Obama, is about to ask the U.S. Congress to approve a 30-year war, which is really an endless war, and somehow we're supposed to be okay about that. But today, I want to talk about the curious question of Veterans Day. Because you know how it is in America. We love our troops, and the lip service of loving our troops is absolutely mandatory. Why do you hate our troops? Why do you hate America? You know the kind of canards that are thrown about. It is interesting that we have this history in the United States of praising soldiers as an obligation, as an expression of patriotism, right? You can't be a patriot if you're not praising the troops. We see cultural enactments of this, football and other events which require a mix of celebrating the warriors, and so war, and sport. Not terribly different from the spirit that governed the gladiatorial games in Rome. And warrior and war always go together. So somehow standing up at a football game and going yay and getting a little teary and applauding and yelling like that is supporting the veterans, supporting troops. But as they say, talk is cheap. So Let's just dig back for a moment into what Veterans Day was originally. It was Armistice Day. I'll get the word out. Armistice Day. It signaled the armistice, the cessation of overt hostilities in World War I, when the guns fell silent at 11 o'clock and 11 minutes in the morning on 11/11. And this was the end of World War I, so we're told. But we have to consider that the ceasefire was only a formal end to the war, only the end to the hostilities themselves, to the shooting. In fact, the United States did not conclude the peace treaty, did not cease being in a state of war with Germany until Harding's administration in 1921. And the United Kingdom, depending on who their revocation of war was against, didn't actually end hostilities until somewhere between 1920 and 1924. Again, varying with which hostile enemy they were talking about. So this curious idea that you have an armistice and then you have a peace treaty. Well, that's really the negotiation of power, the negotiation of lands, the negotiation of reparations, and all of these things that follow. But did World War I really end on 11/11/1918? It certainly didn't start in 1914, but we like our wars neatly boxed. We like them in neat little categories so we can say, well, this is World War I, this is World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, blah, 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 blah. And we give them neat little frames that makes it easy to teach in high school, easy for folks to build monuments about, but that don't really track the history of wars, the evolution of wars, the continuation of wars by other names. But we call it good, we go home, we pull out most of the troops, and we say, well, that war is over. Now, I said that World War I didn't start in 1914. Certainly it didn't. The Balkans, by which I mean that region from Greece northward into Romania, into Albania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Croatia, and over to the Dardanelles, has always been, in recorded history, has always been a place of conflict. But especially from the 17th century forward, when the Ottoman Empire began to withdraw from Europe. It's important to remember that the Turks actually got to the city of Vienna, laid siege to it, and were unable to take the city. And that began a slow rollback of Turkish power. So eventually Croatia, Albania, Bulgaria, Serbia began to establish themselves as separate from the Ottoman Empire. But the funny thing happens when the big powers move out, when the Ottomans move out, the other big powers, which would have been England, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, look at this place that the folks who live there would like to call freed, but they see it as a power vacuum that they need to pull into their sphere. So whether it's the Central Powers or the Romanov family or the English Empire, there's always this attempt to try to claw it back into one's economic and political sphere, much as one would do a colony. And this was certainly the case in the Balkans. There's an even older history to the Balkans that I'm not going to get into in today's show. But going back to the Visigoths, the Huns, virtually every major rampaging group who stormed through the southern half of Europe in the first millennium of the modern age, of the first millennium CE, was moved through this region, moved through the Balkans. So Turkey withdraws. 1908 and 1909, Austria decides to annex, to claim as part of their own territory, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Well, you can imagine how that went over. Not terribly well. In 1912, there was the First Balkan War. So there's a series of small-scale conflicts breaking out through this region. There's a whole series of wars that are sometimes referred to as the Russo-Turkish Wars that were fought in the region of the Crimea for over a century. 1806, 1828, 1853, 1877. All of these were wars not unlike the situations that triggered World War I. So that World War I, what we call it, happened in 1914. Doesn't really give any understanding of why the war would break out. We all know that the Archduke was assassinated by a Serbian, and people just went nuts and went to war. And that's pretty much the common understanding of how World War I developed. But it's a much more complex and historically rooted issue. It has to do with Greeks and Serbs and Romanians gaining independence. It has to do with the great powers trying to involve themselves in the affairs of smaller places. And it's those involvements that led to this cascade effect of having to get involved in a larger and larger and larger and larger conflict. Now, if this sounds vaguely familiar to what's going on in the world today, you're not far off. We have two major powder kegs, and they're actually pretty closely related. One, of course, is the powder keg in Ukraine, which we'll be talking about on next week's show. And the other is the powder keg in another part of the former Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and so on. There's a great deal of confusion, a great deal of deliberate misleading, and frankly just outright lying about both of these conflicts and both of these zones. And I can't do those justice in today's show, but we will be returning to those next year, next week, next year. Gee, I'm optimistic. In our next show, and look at this in more detail. What exactly do we know about Ukraine? What exactly do we know about these people that we're going to have a 30-year war with? What's going on in Syria? Who are these what do they call them? Who are these useful extremists that the U.S. wants to give billions of dollars of equipment to? So that they will do what? Is it ISIS? Is it the Free Syrian Army? Is it al-Nusra? Is it al-Qaeda in Iraq? Well, probably not them. They've got the wrong brand. But you see the problem. So anyway, World War I. Let's get back to it for a moment. It was some people call it the first modern war. Certainly the first hugely mechanized war. The first modern war, in a lot of respects, would probably be the American Civil War. But let's just take World War I, where we had for the first time the introduction of widespread use of the machine gun, widespread use of highly effective, rapid-firing, extremely accurate artillery, poison gas, airplanes, the tank, all the things that make modern warfare the horror than in fact it is. And it was an insanely horrific war. Casualties in this war. 8 million combatants were killed. 7 million combatants were disabled. And 15 million combatants were seriously injured. So that's a total of about 30 million people seriously injured, killed, or disabled in essentially a 4-year conflict. And some part of those were Americans, and we'll get to that bit in a minute. But then we have to think about what were the other effects of the war. When we sign the treaty, we tend to forget. We tend to walk away and go, okay, we put the box around that war now. We understand it. We're finished with it. We're ready to move on. There's nothing more to say about it. Let's just turn our attention to some other place. And we commonly do that. In our teaching about World War I, among the things that seldom get taught were the dislocation, the disruption of supply services, of hospital services, of food, so that we had throughout Europe and throughout much of Eurasia widespread famine and widespread disease. After the war, some 474,000 Germans, 474,000 Germans, civilians, died of starvation, of various diseases they were too weak to fight off. The Germans had it bad, but the Russians lost some 5 to 10 million civilians to famine as a direct outcome of World War I. And let's not forget the Spanish flu, which was spread by the returning soldiers around the world with the alacrity that only modern transport can provide. And the Spanish flu killed some 50 million people, 50 million people worldwide. More than were killed in the war. A lot more, 6 times as many people as were killed in the war. So the other damages we leave behind. We close the door, we ignore the destruction, just like we ignored the destruction in Iraq, just like we ignored the destruction in Bosnia, just like we ignored the destruction in Vietnam. Wherever we go, have the war, boom, we're done, we're out of here. The war is over, let's all go home. And this is a reoccurring theme, not just for this country, but for all countries. So let's just talk then about our veterans, who we hold in such amazingly high esteem, because they tell us we do. And it must be true. They couldn't say it if it wasn't true. As someone once said to me, why golly, that's the First Amendment. Anyway, so if we look at the veterans, and we have veterans from Vietnam, from Grenada, from Panama, from Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and on and on. And so we have a lot of vets roaming the streets in the U.S. And, okay, we give them the VA hospital, and some VA hospitals are very, very good. I hear by all accounts the one in Spokane is a remarkably good VA hospital. But I think many of us can remember the horror stories about Walter Reed with the rats and the water coming through the walls and the mildew. And it's not that the Veterans Administration is uniformly wonderful, not according to a lot of accounts. But if we look at just the veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, about half of the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have physical or mental problems from their service. That's 1.3 million veterans with physical or mental problems from their service. If we look at suicides, 22 veterans in this country commit suicide every day. Most of them are over 50. but 22 veterans suicide every day. We have more vet suicides in 1 year than we had killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Combat deaths, in fact, in Iraq were an average of 2.4 a day. Compare that to 22. It's 10 times higher. In about 19%. I'm sorry, I'm a little pulled off my feed here. I have a car alarm beeping outside. 19% of all Iraqi vets suffer either from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or from traumatic brain injury. That's 1 in 5. 1 in 5 Iraqi vets suffer from PTSD or TBI, traumatic brain injury. So PTSD is kind of understandable. Soldiers were put into combat situations for extremely long periods of time. They were given very little time at home. They were rotated back in, and they did very, very long stays for the most part. 2, 3, 4 tours and more were not uncommon. So a big part of that explains the PTSD. And the TBI, the traumatic brain injury, well, we've gotten so good at our armaments and our body armor and our vehicles that a lot of soldiers who would have died don't. They survive, but they still have injuries, and among those are traumatic brain injury. That's one cause. The other cause is the nature of the kinds of attacks, a lot of improvised explosive devices, bombs, booby traps on roadsides that weren't enough to kill in some cases, especially in armored vehicles, but were quite capable of causing traumatic brain injury. So this is one of the legacies of our veterans and how we have failed them in some fundamental ways. Suicides doubled between 2001 and 2006. Not all vets with problems end up killing themselves. A number of them end up in prison. That we currently have about 140,000 veterans in prison in the U.S. Many of these, about 70% of them, have drug and alcohol problems. And about 20% of the homeless in this country are veterans. So we talk a really good story about the excellent care we do our veterans, but we have some troubles living up to it. And if we really did care about our veterans, we would treat them much better. But we have a long history of not treating them well. And I'm going to take a little break here. And when I return, we'll talk about some of the ways we have not treated them well historically. So stay with us. You are listening to Long Waves here on KYRS 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. KYRS Medical Lake and Spokane.
It's been Washington's biggest mystery since Watergate. What kind of dog will the Obamas choose? Our resident veterinarian, Dr.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
And look, this is one time. Forget the conspiracy. Listen to our government agencies. These guys are telling the truth. You know, there's no conspiracy here, folks. Just get your damn vaccine.
All right. Thank you, doctor. Thank you.
Mercury-containing vaccines may help, not harm kids, according to 2 new studies in the journal Pediatrics. There have been widespread concerns that mercury-based preservatives in vaccines might impair the neurological development of children. These new studies suggest that the opposite, that the preservatives may actually be associated with improved behavior and mental performance.
I think people should be careful what they wish for on China. You know, if China were to revalue its currency, or China is to start making, say, toys that don't have lead in them or food that isn't poisonous, their costs of production are going to go up, and that means prices at Walmart here in the United States are going to go up too. So I would say China is our greatest friend right now. They're keeping prices low, and they're keeping prices for...
Today, 6 corporations control all major media in the United States, including the principal television networks. These 6 corporate entities, in turn, control the information being broadcast on a daily basis. The average American adult watches more than 4 hours of television each day. The constant flow of entertainment, news, and information that is consumed by the American public shapes their perception of the reality in which they live. By controlling the dissemination of information, broadcasters and their corporate heads are able to control the masses. The constant, carefully shaped messages on television guide the public to predetermined conclusions. Therefore, TV has become a weapon of mass persuasion. In order to take back our minds and our lives, we must first unplug the signal. Turn off your televisions. Cancel your cable and satellite subscriptions. Seek alternative news sources. Spend time with your family and connect with your neighbors and local community. Discuss and learn. Allow new information to challenge your thoughts and opinions. When we unplug the signal, we begin to realize that the world matrix that surrounds us is false. Many things we once thought of as true are lies. Never let us forget the truth will not be televised.
And that was a little piece from 44 Connected on YouTube called How Media Mind Control Works. Anyway, in that same vein, I need to read a public service announcement here. There is a rally Thursday, November 13th at 6 p.m. at the federal courthouse to pressure the FCC to protect internet freedom or net neutrality. The courthouse is located at 920 West Riverside in Spokane. Information on Facebook at Emergency Protest Spokane. And on a slightly happier note, I should also encourage you, don't miss the party of the year. It's the KYRS 11th anniversary celebration and silent auction, 7 p.m. Saturday, November 15th at Riverside Place, formerly the Masonic Center downtown on Riverside. Live music by Malanga, craft ale from Iron Goat and Paradise Creek, cider from Liberty Cider Works and Townsend Wine. Amazing silent auction items include ski passes, GU men's basketball tickets, B&B stays, and more. Celebrate 11 years of independent community radio, November 15th. $15 for kids under I'll do that again. $15 for adults. Kids under 13 are free. Tickets are available at kyrs.org or by calling 509-747-3012. You can also buy tickets at the door. So let's go back and talk about the history of our veterans and their general lack of pleasure with how they were treated. In 1781, the Continental Army, which had been mustered out without being paid, marched on Philadelphia to demand their money. That's where the government was located at the time. Congress fled in fear. Eventually, the Army came in and put down the mustered-out Continental Army. But this was the beginning of a series of slights to the ex-military, to our veterans. This was the beginning of a series of promises that were never lived up to. Let's fast forward here to 1894. And this is Coxey's Army, which marched to D.C. And they had the most interesting request. They wanted the government to invest in infrastructure in the country to provide jobs. So it wasn't just them screaming, give us our money. It was invest in infrastructure, create jobs so that we can get decent work. And this is a recurring issue around veterans' concerns. 1924, Coolidge, gotta love him, Coolidge vetoed bonuses that had been promised to the soldiers to make up the difference between what they were paid in World War I and what they could have made in the civilian world. So there was a deal cut, and these were bonuses that would have eventually matured completely in 1945. But Coolidge vetoed it, saying that, quote, patriotism bought and paid for is not patriotism. I'll just say that again. Patriotism bought and paid for is not patriotism. Well, maybe he should have told that to the speculators and war profiteers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the ones who made immense fortunes by gouging the government in manufacturing and supplying wars, but there's nothing new about that. Then let's fast forward just a few years to the bonus army, again, who were trying to get their bonuses. This is 1932, and they go to Washington, D.C., a rather large number, and they set up headquarters at Anacostia Flats. It was this nasty little swamp-like flat ground, and were camping out and would periodically go over to the White House and camp out on the grounds over there around the mall. So this went on for a while until the police tried to cast them out, and there was a scuffle and two soldiers were killed. And then the army was sent in to remove them. It's reported that when the soldiers first saw the army coming down Pennsylvania Avenue, they thought the army was coming to support them, and they cheered. And when they realized why the army was really there, they began chanting, shame, 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 that their own brothers in arms would be turned against them. Interestingly, the operation was commanded by the Army Chief of Staff. That was Dugout Douglas MacArthur. And his adjutant for the operation was none other than Dwight David Eisenhower. They had 6 tanks, and the tanks were commanded by Patton. So they rolled in, chased them off of the mall in Washington back to Anacostia Flats, and in violation of Truman's orders, MacArthur decided to pursue them there and smash up their village, which he promptly did. So this is the history of dealing with soldiers' concerns in a nutshell. In a nutshell. But, we really shouldn't be surprised at any of this. If you consider what the attitude of power must be toward those in service. Henry Kissinger famously summed up his attitude toward soldiers. I quote, "Soldiers are dumb, stupid animals for the conduct of foreign policy." Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, and still the grand old man, said, soldiers are dumb, stupid animals for the conduct of foreign policy. So should we really be surprised at how veterans are treated? Should we really be surprised how soldiers are treated? How else would power consider them except as toys to use to achieve what you want, and then you're done with them and you try to make them go away? Which has a parallel in the way that power tends to view citizenry. That's ordinary folks like you and me. That's not the Koch brothers or Eric Prince, their brother-in-law, the guy who owns Blackwater. It's not, Jamie Dimon. Ordinary folks like you and me. William Casey, head of the CIA under Reagan, took his position in 1981, and his very first staff meeting, and this is no secret, it's well documented, he said, quote, "We'll know when our disinformation program is complete, when everything the public believes is false." Okay, let's hear that again. We'll know when our disinformation program is complete, when everything the public believes is false. So, soldiers, dumb, stupid animals for the conduct of foreign policy, citizenry to be fed lies, propaganda, until everything they believe is exactly what power wants them to believe. So, we forget our vets. We betrayed them. We stole from them. The government did. MacArthur, well, I won't even go into MacArthur here. But we have the vets who returned from war with experiences that only other vets understand. This is one reason vets like to talk to each other. Civilians have no idea. They cannot comprehend the experience of combat. And vets who can't share this with other vets, and even some who can, are often forced to live in hells of various kind, without treatment, without help, without assistance, or unwilling to seek such assistance and help as is there. But we also forget another group of people who, in a sense, are veterans, not in that they wore uniforms and were combatants, but that they were in the front lines. They were the collateral damage. They were the civilians, the children, the old who die of starvation and disease. The Spanish flu was a great combatant. It came a bit late in the war, and it was a bit indiscriminate in who it took down, but it was a great combatant. 50 million dead from the Spanish flu, so-called. Millions succumbed. But now we have other kinds of interesting issues going on, other kinds of civilian damage, excluding the ones who are killed outright. And I don't know if you saw the pictures from Gaza, and the video from Gaza. I don't know if you've seen the pictures and the videos from Fallujah, from Kosovo. I don't know if you've seen these, but if you haven't, you should. I'll put some of those on a Facebook page I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Because there's no way to convey in words what the damage looks like. There's no way to express it. One of the most pernicious effects of it is the long-term effect on the health of ordinary people, the people who live there. In Fallujah, there's been an enormous spike in cancers and particularly in birth defects. The Fallujah General Hospital says that there's a 14.7% incidence of birth defects. 14.7%. And many of these are horrific, and they are often multiple defects. We're talking children with their organs born outside of their bodies. We're talking cleft palates. We're talking grotesque deformities. The incidence of birth defects in Fallujah alone is 14 times higher than the incidence of birth defects in Hiroshima and Nagasaki following the bomb. And it's probably a grossly underreported problem because only 40 to 50% of births are treated at hospitals. Most Iraqis have, or an equal number of Iraqis, have their children at home. They don't go to the hospital. If there's a stillbirth, if there's a grotesque deformity that leads to death very shortly, these almost certainly never get reported. So Basra reported a 7-fold increase in birth defects. Childhood leukemia doubled between 2003 and 2007. Now, what was going on in this period? There was a lot of fighting in Basra and in Fallujah. A lot of weapons were used, and one of the culprits that's commonly held up as the likely cause of these birth defects is depleted uranium, which is a material widely used in U.S. and some other nations, artillery rounds and also in cannon rounds, like chain gun cannons from helicopters and A-10s. When it hits something, it vaporizes, and you end up with vaporized uranium. Abdullah Haq al-Ari, who is a doctor in Iraq, personally said he measured the radiation in Kabul, and he said it was off the scale of the device he was using. He couldn't actually get a reading. He spoke of multiple cancers, stomach and kidney simultaneously, which I'm told is a fairly rare kind of occurrence. And a lot of people have said, well, this is DU, this is depleted uranium, and they found evidence of depleted uranium in fingernails, in teeth, in bones, in hair. But there's a whole range of interesting chemical cocktails that go into weaponry, and when those weapons explode, these interesting chemicals end up introduced to people's drinking water, air, food, skin. So in addition to depleted uranium, we need to consider the impact of weapons like white phosphorus, known in the military as WP or Willie Peter, mercury, lead, all of which are genotoxic, all of which cause birth defects. So we have this problem that's not our problem, and it's something we're never going to address, almost certainly. We'll leave it to Iraq, and gosh knows they're in such an excellent position to address these issues. But you can hear the deep sarcasm here, right? Okay, good. So enormous birth defects, and I'm not even getting into the birth defects in Vietnam from the widespread use of Agent Orange, or the birth defects in Kosovo, again from side effects of weaponry almost certainly. But it is important to note that Article 35 of Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention prohibits superfluous injuries and unnecessary suffering. Right? So superfluous injuries, you kill and hurt people you aren't aiming at, and you cause suffering that doesn't have to be caused to complete the military objective. Well, plainly, the effects of modern weapons don't meet that. And also from Protocol 1, Article 36 demands a legal review of each new weapon to see if it meets these requirements. But something tells me that would just get in the way of all the fun that the U.S. is having with its military. So, not only our veterans, but the civilians overseas, the civilians in the countries that we want to invade, the civilians in the countries that we blow apart. And we forget it. We forget the long wave of the war that started long before the war. World War I, everybody saw World War I coming, and everyone was helpless to stop it. Helpless to stop it. Carl Jung once said that he could have predicted World War II from the dreams of his patients. If he'd never studied a day of history, the dreams of his patients were enough to tell him the anxieties. the concerns that were showing up in people who were in his receiving room. So the long wave of war that starts centuries often prior to the conflict, that has the very short wave, the blip of the war itself, which we tend to think is the matter. And then the long wave of sequela, of consequences that follow on. And in some cases, the first war still has to be resolved. World War I didn't end in 1918. It didn't end with World War II, which was a continuance, in a sense, of the first one. It's still going on. It's lower conflict, but the same players are involved. The same territory is involved. The Balkans, the Ukraine, the Middle East. The same issues are driving it. And it will be no more successfully resolved this time than it was in 1914-18 or 1939-45. We will have no more success at this than they'd had before. So this raises a whole bunch of interesting questions now, doesn't it? We all talk about wanting to put an end to war, but if we're not even seeing war as a long-term process of the destabilization of power, of greed, of empires seeking to extend their control into other people's countries, other people's economies, other people's lives. If we don't even conceive of this, we have no way of understanding the causes of war or the ways to bring about the end. I was speaking with a veteran the other day, and he said, do you think it would help if ordinary people had more skin in the game? If ordinary civilians had more skin in the game of wars, would we take better care of our veterans? And I thought, well, and I believe I said to him, it's not that ordinary people need more skin in the game. That's important. But we have to take the profit out of war. We have to take the ease with which the wealthy and the political class in this country and all countries lead us to war and adjust that, fix that. Without fixing that, it's just nonsense. It'll be wars and wars forever. Or as the old man says in 1984, it's all wars. And here we stand on the precipice of what President Obama is proudly calling a 30-year war. His own Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, is seriously opposed to this idea. But there it stands. A 30-year war. Now, think of what the consequences of that will be. You know, in the Middle East, we're fighting people who have conflicts going back centuries, millennia. And here we are, pretending that we're going to fix it. We're going to go in there and shoot some people. We're going to do like we did in Afghanistan. We're going to spend a lot of money, prop up some tin pots, and then go merrily on our way. It didn't work in Afghanistan. It will never work in Afghanistan. Let us remember the nickname of Afghanistan is Graveyard of Empires. Everyone who ever went there had to deal with Pashtunwali, which means the Pashtun way, a way of living, a kind of anarchy as organized violence, or organized violence as anarchy. And it's remarkably effective. It stopped the Russian war machine. It stopped the British twice in the 19th century. And it stopped the United States. It so effectively stopped the British that Rudyard Kipling, in his poem to a British soldier, concluded with these lines, and I think I recall it correctly. It goes like this: When they leave you lying wounded on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come with knives to carve up your remains, roll over on your rifle, boy, and blow out your brains, and meet your maker like a soldier. So Kipling understood Afghanistan. He fought there. The British learned some hard lessons. The Russians learned some hard lessons, and you would have thought the Americans would have learned hard lessons, but Americans never seem to be capable of learning anything. They're going to go ahead and do what they're going to do. And part of this is because we have hit this period in our history, in our lives, where, in a very real sense, we do look a lot like Rome. Not in the sense that there's this great moral decay, not in the sense that, that we worship it, we've quit worshiping the gods or whatever. But in some more interesting senses, in the sense that, as happened in Rome, in the U.S., genuine political activity has ceased. Now, in Rome, it was replaced with law and rhetoric and bread and circuses. In the U.S., it's replaced with Honey Boo Boo and the Duggars and lots of law and surveillance. Lots and lots of law and surveillance. H.S. Maine, in his book Ancient Law, wrote, quote, "It was jurisprudence and jurisprudence only which stood in the place of poetry and history, of philosophy and science. Jurisprudence and jurisprudence alone which stood in the place of poetry and history, of philosophy and science." Doesn't that sound like our world? With the Defense Authorization Act, with the Patriot Act, with the eternal surveillance, the eternal monitoring, the eternal threat to all of us. It's curious. In 1980, in the whole of the United States, there were 3,000 SWAT deployments. 3,000 in 1980. In 2013, there were 60,000. That's a 20-fold increase. That's crazy. And yet, we still think, many of us, that our actions abroad do not reflect our actions at home, and our actions at home are no reflection of our actions abroad. They are two sides of the same coin. And as was revealed in this month's Harper Index, which I love, percentage of Americans who support military intervention against the Islamic State, 62%. So 62% of Americans support military intervention against the Islamic State. Yet 68% think it's unlikely to succeed. So we're going to pursue a military intervention that even the American people don't think will work. Now, what does that say about us as a people? What does it say about our government? What does it say about our understanding of the world? Military action without hope of success is death, mayhem, murder, destruction. For what? Vengeance? Power? For what? What do we get out of it? What do our veterans get out of it? We know what the people who live there get out of it. And that, my friends, is Buckley's, as they would say, down under. Whoa, I think I am out of time. I just noticed the clock here. I'd better quit talking. Thank you so much for joining the premiere episode of Long Waves. I'll be back next week at the same time, 3 o'clock. You can email me, longwaves@kyrs.org. That's longwaves, all one word, at kyrs.org. And very shortly, I will have a Facebook page up and running. And you can also check, I'll be posting stories there and other matters. So again, thank you so much for joining. I hope you'll be back with me next week. It's a little interesting kind of getting back behind the microphone, but here I am. So until next week, Have a great one.